She stood in front of 60 acres of dead land, holding a bill of sale that had cost her almost everything she owned. And every single person watching her believed she had just made the worst mistake of her life. The richest man in the valley laughed out loud. The banker shook his head. Old women clicked their tongues walking past. Even the wind seemed to push back against her, dry and hot and indifferent. Clara Whitmore didn't flinch. She folded the paper, tucked it into her coat, and looked out at the thorns, the rocks, the cracked and sunburned earth, and she smiled. If you want to find out what Clara saw that no one else could, stay with us until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction had drawn a small crowd for a Thursday morning. Maybe 30 people clustered outside the Dustfall Land Registry office, fanning themselves with their hats and speaking in the low, bored tones of men who already knew how the day was going to go. Nobody expected much. The parcel being auctioned off, 62 acres in the low basin the locals called Dead Thorn Valley, had been sitting unclaimed for 11 years. 3 different owners had tried to work it. 3 different owners had walked away. The last one, a stubborn cattleman named Pruitt, had simply stopped coming one spring and never returned. His cattle had lost 20 pounds each on that land. His hired hands had quit after a month of fighting through brush so thick and thorned they couldn't move a horse through it at a walk. The county had eventually taken it for unpaid taxes, and the general consensus in Dustfall was that even the county had gotten a bad deal. The bidding opened at $40. No one moved. The auctioneer, a sweating man named Doyle with ink stains on his cuffs, raised the paper he was holding and peered over it at the crowd. $40, gentlemen. 62 acres, mineral rights included. Someone? Silence. 35 then. More silence. A dog wandered through the edge of the crowd and lay down in the shade of a hitching post. That was when Clara Whitmore raised her hand. She was standing near the back, which was why most people hadn't noticed her yet. She was a woman of about 34, lean in the way of someone who hadn't been eating particularly well for a while, with dark hair pinned up under a plain gray hat and a canvas travel bag sitting at her feet. She didn't look like she belonged to the valley. She didn't look like she belonged anywhere specific, which, at that moment in her life, was more accurate than she would have admitted. 35, she said clearly. Doyle blinked at her. The crowd turned. There was a pause, the particular pause that happens in small towns when something unexpected walks in. 35 from the lady, Doyle said carefully. Do I hear 40? I'll go to 160. The voice came from the far left of the crowd, and it came with the particular ease of a man who had never had to think very hard about money. Garrett Holloway was 48 years old, broad-shouldered, and wore his wealth in the same casual way he wore his belt, like it had always been there and always would be. He owned the largest spread in the county, the Holloway Ranch, which ran along the northern ridge and controlled the only reliable water source in the valley. He had no real interest in Dead Thorn Valley. He just didn't like surprises. Clara didn't look at him. 170. A ripple went through the crowd. Someone coughed a laugh. Garrett tilted his head slightly like a man who has just noticed an interesting insect. 200. 220. Now people were watching properly. Garrett studied her for a moment, her plain clothes, her single bag, the set of her jaw, and made the calculation that most people in his position made quickly and instinctively. He decided she couldn't go much higher. He was almost right. Clara spent $430 that morning. It was most of what she had. The money had come from selling her mother's furniture, her own small house in the eastern town of Caldwell, and 3 months of wages she'd saved from working the front desk of a dry goods supply company. She had not made the decision lightly, and she had made it alone, which meant there was no one to blame and no one to reassure her. When Doyle handed her the paperwork, she signed it with a hand that did not shake, even though her heart was hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Garrett Holloway walked past her as the crowd dispersed. He didn't say anything, but he looked at the document in her hand the way a man looks at a chess piece, moved to a position he finds mildly irritating. Then he put his hat on and walked to his horse without looking back. The land was worse than she had expected, and she had expected bad. Clara borrowed a mule from the livery in Dustfall and rode out to the property the same afternoon, following a rough map Doyle had drawn her on the back of a receipt. The road, calling it a road was generous, petered out about a quarter-mile from the property line, swallowed by encroaching scrub. She tied the mule to a fence post that was leaning at roughly 45 degrees and continued on foot. Deadthorn Valley was not dramatic in any picturesque way. It wasn't cliffs or canyons or any kind of landscape that made a person feel small in an interesting sense. It was just relentlessly difficult terrain. Mesquite bushes grew in impenetrable thickets, their thorns long and curved and mean. Below them, the ground was cracked adobe clay, bone dry on top, hard as pavement. Rocky outcroppings surfaced at irregular intervals. The grass, where it existed at all, was dead and brittle. The whole place smelled faintly of dust and old heat. Clara walked the edge of it for about 40 minutes, pushing through the brush where she could, backtracking where she couldn't. She got a thorn through the back of her hand at some point and bled on her sleeve. She tore the hem of her skirt on a low branch and didn't bother stopping to check how bad the damage was. She was looking for something specific, and she eventually found it, the soil underneath. In 3 places where erosion or animal activity had scraped back the surface crust, she could see that the soil beneath was darker. Not black, not rich, but darker, with a finer texture, the kind that held on to moisture. In one spot near the base of a long, low slope, she crouched down and dug with her fingers and found it turned to a cooler, slightly damp earth less than 4 inches below the surface. She sat back on her heels and looked at the thickets around her, and what she was thinking was not particularly romantic. She was thinking, the brush is the problem, and the brush can be solved. She had read about it. More than read. She had talked at length over several months with a woman named Mara Voss. Mara Voss was 61 years old and had been farming the same dry patch of ground east of Dustfall for 32 years. And she had a reputation in the community as someone whose opinions on land management were either brilliant or unhinged, depending on who you asked. She was a small woman with white-streaked hair and a habit of speaking in complete considered sentences even when she was discussing something ordinary like what she was making for supper. Clara had met her by accident, arriving in Dustfall 3 months earlier with money in her pocket and a general idea of finding land she could actually afford. She had knocked on the wrong door asking for directions to the land registry, and Mara had answered it, looked her over, and said, "You're not from here. Come have coffee." 2 hours later, Clara was still at her kitchen table. "Deadthorn Valley," Mara had said at some point, in the tone of a person pulling a memory from a long distance away. "I knew a man who tried it 20 years ago. He brought cattle. Wrong animal." What would be the right one? Mara had looked at her. Goats. Brush goats, specifically. Spanish breed if you can find them. They'll eat through mesquite thickets that would stop a bulldozer. They have to, because they're not delicate animals. They go after what they want. You put 50 of them on that land and leave them for a season, they'll clear ground no human crew could manage in 2 years. Clara had sat with that for a moment. And then what? Then you see what's underneath. That land has been smothered for a long time. Could be nothing. Could be something worth having. Mara had shrugged, in the way of someone who has learned not to promise outcomes. Land keeps its secrets until you give it a reason to show you. That had been 3 months ago. Clara had spent those months doing exactly what Mara told her. Researching goat breeds, finding suppliers, calculating how many she could afford after buying the land, working out what she'd need to set up basic fencing, shelter, water. The math had been uncomfortable. She had enough for the land and a herd of 50, with almost nothing left over for the first several months of operation. If the goats didn't work, if the land underneath was truly useless, she would be out of options in a way that was fairly final. She had made the calculation anyway. She found a room to rent at the edge of Dustfall, a single room above a grain storage building owned by a widow named Aldous. It smelled like burlap and had a window that faced west, so the afternoon light came in sharp and hot. She paid a month's rent in advance and set up her situation. Her books on the sill, her spare clothes in the trunk, her papers on the small table. The town noticed her in the way that small towns notice strangers. She would feel it in the general store. The way conversations didn't stop but shifted slightly, became more careful. She heard things at the edges. A woman saying to her companion, just a touch too loudly, "That's the one who bought the Pruitt land. Can you imagine?" And the companion's answering murmur of amusement. She did not let it bother her the way it might have once. She had made her choice. Getting bothered about what people thought of it was a use of energy she couldn't afford. The goats arrived on a Tuesday, driven up in 2 wagons from a supplier in the south named Perez, who had shaken her hand at the gate and said with genuine sympathy, "You sure about this, ma'am? That's rough country." "I'm sure," she said. 50 Spanish brush goats were, as it turned out, a spectacle. They were not gentle animals. They were not particularly clean animals. They were loud, opinionated, and seemed to operate with a general philosophy of aggressive curiosity. Every fence needed testing, every unfamiliar object needed investigation, every person needed to be head-butted at least once to determine their level of threat. The man who had agreed to help her manage them was Eli Carter, 17 years old, the youngest son of a farming family whose land adjoined hers on the east side. He had shown up the day after the goats arrived, leaned on her fence post and said, "I heard you got goats." "I did." "Nobody else out here has goats." "I know." He had considered this. He had the look of a boy who found things interesting that other people didn't bother to find interesting. "I'll help," he said. "Don't want paying right now. My family's got enough. I just want to see what happens." She had studied him for a moment. "You'll work hard." "Yes, ma'am." "And I'll yell at you when you do something wrong." "Yes, ma'am." "All right," she said. The first weeks were rough in the specific way that all beginnings are rough. Not catastrophic, just grinding and full of small problems that added up. 2 goats got through a gap in the eastern fence the first night and ended up in a neighbor's vegetable patch. One of the larger males, whom Eli had taken to calling General, developed an obsession with Clara's supply wagon and had to be physically relocated twice a day. The water trough she'd set up was the wrong height and had to be rebuilt. Her hands blistered, then the blisters hardened, then the hardened skin cracked in the dry air. But the goats went to work. Within the first 2 weeks, they had cleared a noticeable section near the south boundary. Not pretty, not efficient, but real. Where there had been 6-foot mesquite thickets, there was now a rough, chewed-down expanse of ground with ankle-high stubs and exposed soil. The goats moved through it with the cheerful destructiveness of creatures who had no opinion about whether the work was impressive or not. They just ate. Clara walked that cleared ground every morning before the light got harsh, doing what Mara had told her to do, looking at what the soil was doing, checking how it responded to the previous night's small dew, watching whether any native grass seed was starting to move. She crouched down and felt it with her hands. She took notes in a small book she kept in her apron pocket. In the 3rd week, she found the first thing that made her breath catch. Under a section the goats had cleared to bare earth, in the lowest part of the natural slope, a faint line of green was threading up through the cracked surface. Not much. A few blades of native bluestem grass, so thin they were almost invisible. But they were there, and they were there because the soil was holding just enough moisture to let them be. She looked at them for a long time. Then she took out her notebook and wrote a single line. "Something is here." Back in town that evening, she overheard 2 ranchers at the feed store discussing the situation at the Holloway Ranch. One of them glanced at her when she came in, said something quiet to his companion, and they both offered the particular smile of men who have decided not to explain the joke. She bought her supplies and left without speaking to either of them. On the road back, she passed Garrett Holloway's land, fenced, maintained, watered from the creek that ran along the northern ridge. Cattle visible in the distance, everything in order, everything established. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you are thinking about in a specific way. Then she turned her mule toward the valley and went back to work. There was a long way still to go, and she knew it. The land hadn't given up its secrets yet. The goats had barely touched the full acreage. Her money would last another 4 months, maybe 5 if she was careful, and after that the work would need to start paying for itself. She had no guarantee it would. But the grass was coming up through the cracked earth, thin and stubborn and alive. And that was enough, for now, to keep her moving. The grass came back slow. That was the first thing Clara learned about the land. It didn't give anything back quickly, and it didn't give anything back for free. Every inch of recovered ground cost something. Time, labor, the skin off her palms, sleep she didn't get because she was lying awake running numbers in a notebook that never quite added up the way she needed them to. By the end of the 2nd month, the goats had cleared roughly 8 acres of the southern section. 8 acres out of 62. It didn't sound like much, and standing at the edge of the cleared ground and looking back at the wall of mesquite that still dominated the majority of the property, it didn't feel like much either. But the 8 acres were doing something. The exposed soil was breathing. Native grass was threading up in patches. Not carpet, not meadow. Just ragged clusters of green pushing through the cracked surface wherever the ground held a little moisture. In the mornings, when the air was still cool and the light came in low and sideways, those patches caught the dew and held it, and the whole cleared section had a different smell than the rest of the land. Less dust. Something underneath that was harder to name. Eli noticed it before Clara said anything. He was not a boy who talked a great deal, but one morning he stood at the edge of the recovered ground with his arms crossed and said, "It smells like after rain." "It does," Clara said. "Hasn't rained." "No." He looked at her, then back at the ground. "Is that good?" "I think so," she said. "I don't know yet." She wrote to Mara that evening, describing what she was seeing in the careful, specific language she'd learned to use. Not hopeful, not pessimistic, just precise. Mara wrote back within the week, as she always did, her handwriting cramped and efficient on the page. "The smell is good. It means the soil profile is active. Keep your goats off the cleared sections for now. Let whatever wants to come up, come up. Don't help it too much. Land that's been smothered that long gets confused if you push it." Clara read the letter twice, folded it into her notebook, and the next morning moved the goat rotation to the northeast section, leaving the recovered southern ground to do whatever it was going to do without interference. She didn't share the letter with anyone except Eli, and even with him she only showed the relevant passage. The rest of her communication with Mara felt private in a way she couldn't entirely explain. Not secretive, just personal, the way you keep certain conversations separate from the public version of your life because they belong to a different part of you. The public version of her life in Dustfall was going fine, which is to say it was going the way things go when you are a woman alone doing something that confuses people. People were polite in the distant, practiced way of those who have decided not to invest in you yet. The woman at the general store, whose name was Agnes, had softened slightly after Clara had been coming in regularly for 2 months. She now asked after the goats with a kind of amused tolerance, the way you ask after a neighbor's odd hobby. The men at the feed store had stopped making comments she could hear, which she counted as progress. Garrett Holloway she saw occasionally, at the feed store or passing on the main road. He always acknowledged her, a nod, sometimes a brief tip of his hat, with the controlled courtesy of a man who has decided you are not worth his active attention, but is too careful to be openly rude. She returned the acknowledgement and kept moving. She had no particular feelings about him one way or another at that point. He was a fact of the landscape, like the rocky outcroppings on her property, or the afternoon wind that came up from the south and dried everything out by 3 o'clock. What she did not know, and would not learn until later, was that Garrett had ridden out to the edge of Dead Thorn Valley in the 3rd week of her operation and looked at what she was doing from a distance, sitting on his horse at the ridgeline for nearly half an hour before turning back. His foreman, a quiet man named Decker, had been with him. "She's got goats," Decker had said, somewhat unnecessarily. "I can see that." "For the brush?" Garrett had looked at the cleared southern section for a long moment. "Apparently." Decker had waited. "She won't make it," Garrett had said finally. "Not enough capital. Wrong season to start. The land's got nothing to give her, even if she clears it." He had turned his horse. "But keep an eye on it." Decker kept an eye on it. The 3rd month brought the first real problem, and it came from the east fence. The Carters, Eli's family, ran a modest grain operation on the adjoining land. They were decent people, quiet and careful, and they had not objected to their youngest son spending his days on Clara's property. But in the 3rd month, a section of her eastern fencing collapsed under pressure from a drainage channel that ran along the property line, and 14 of her goats got through before Eli caught it. The goats did not go into the Carter grain fields. They went in the other direction, into a section of scrubland that technically belonged to a man named Ferris, who ran a small horse operation 2 properties over and who had not been consulted about anything. Ferris arrived at Clara's property at 7 in the morning, before the day had gotten fully started, sitting on a wagon with his arms folded and his face set in the particular expression of a man rehearsing grievances. He was maybe 50, weathered and stiff-shouldered, and he had clearly been looking forward to this conversation. "Your animals," he said, We're in my scrubland. Clara had been up since 5 and had already repaired the fence by the time he arrived. She had also, that morning, found 2 more of the native grass clusters in the recovered section, and she was in a mental state that was cautiously close to something she might call encouraged, which made it harder than it should have been to deal with Ferris at full diplomatic capacity. "I know," she said. "I found the break last night. It's fixed." "They were in there for at least 2 days. Probably. What damage did they do?" Ferris opened his mouth, then closed it slightly. He had been expecting more resistance. "They ate through some brush along my north edge. Any grass? Any crop? Any structure damage?" "No, but then I'll pay you for the brush," Clara said. "What's fair?" That stopped him entirely. He sat on his wagon for a moment, recalibrating. "Well, I don't know what you'd... Name a number and I'll tell you if it's honest." He named a number. It was slightly high but not outrageous, which told her he was annoyed but not actually trying to take advantage of her. She paid it from the small emergency cash she kept in a tin under the floorboard of her room. It left her with less buffer than she was comfortable with. After Ferris left, Eli appeared from behind the barn where he had been doing fence repair and said, "You didn't have to pay him that much." "I know. His scrubland isn't worth..." "Eli," she said, "I'm not going to fight about money with neighbors I need to live next to for the next 20 years. That's not how you build a place in a community." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone absorbing a principle he hadn't considered before. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work, and Clara went back to the recovered section to look at the grass. By the end of the 4th month, the goats had cleared 18 acres. It wasn't a dramatic number. It didn't look dramatic from the road. But something was happening in those 18 acres that Clara had started documenting with increasing specificity in her notebook, because she was beginning to understand that what she was seeing wasn't just recovery, it was something she hadn't fully anticipated. The native grass was not just threading up in clusters anymore. In the lowest section of the cleared ground, where the natural slope channeled whatever moisture the land held, the grass had started to consolidate. Not thick, not yet, but connected. Patches that had grown toward each other and begun to interlock at their edges. The root systems were doing something underground that the surface was just starting to reflect. And in that lowest section, on particularly cool mornings, the ground was visibly damp before any dew had fallen. She brought Mara out to look at it. Mara drove her own wagon, arrived at 7 in the morning on a Thursday, and walked the cleared section for 20 minutes without saying much. She crouched down in the low area and pushed her fingers into the soil and held them there. She moved to 3 different spots and did the same thing. Then she stood up, brushed her hands on her trousers, and looked at Clara. "There's a water table closer to the surface than anyone knew," she said. "That slope is pulling from it. The goats cleared the brush that was intercepting it." Clara felt something shift in her chest. She kept her voice level. "How close?" "Can't say without digging, but the moisture pattern you're seeing..." Mara gestured at the low section. "That's not dew retention. That's upwelling. Something down there is moving toward the surface." She was quiet for a moment. "Have you seen anything on the ridge, on the high ground?" "There's a rock formation up there. The goats have been congregating around it lately. I thought it was just shade." Mara looked at her steadily. "Show me." They walked to the high point of the property together, where a scatter of large flat stones sat exposed on a low ridge. The goats had been spending time up there every afternoon, which Clara had attributed to the way heat moved on the property. The rocks caught the afternoon shade and the animals were practical. But as she watched Mara walk around the largest stone, crouching to examine the ground around its base, she felt a different explanation beginning to form. "Do you hear that?" Mara said. Clara listened. There was the wind. There were the goats 100 yards away moving through the brush. There was the ambient dry silence of a hot afternoon. And then, under all of it, very faint, a hollow quality to the sound when the wind dropped, like the stone was sitting on empty space. "What is that?" Clara said. "Old construction," Mara said. She put both palms flat on the stone's surface and pressed gently. "Or natural formation. Hard to say, but that stone has been placed. Look at the edges. Too regular to be settled naturally." She stood up and looked at Clara. "You're going to want to investigate that." "When?" "Not today, but soon." Mara looked across the property, the cleared acres, the remaining thickets, the line of pale green pushing through the broken ground. and I'd keep quiet about it until you know what you have. That was good advice, and Clara followed it, but keeping quiet about it was harder than it sounded because by that point, the cleared sections had become visible from the road, and people had started to notice. It was Agnes at the general store who first said it directly to Clara's face. She had come in for flour and lamp oil on a Saturday afternoon, and Agnes had wrapped the flour in paper and slid it across the counter and said, without particular ceremony, "I heard your land is coming around." "Some of it," Clara said. "The goats?" "Mostly." Agnes considered her for a moment. She was a woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and an expression that was generally watchful without being unfriendly. "Holloway came in yesterday," she said. "Asked about you." Clara was folding the receipt. She kept folding it. "What did he ask?" "Just if you were managing, whether you had help coming in, whether anyone was backing you." Agnes paused. "I told him you were doing fine and that I didn't know of any backers." "That's accurate." "I know." Agnes handed her the lamp oil. "He's paying attention to you, Clara. Thought you should know that." Clara walked back to her room that afternoon with the flour and the lamp oil and the information, and she sat at her small table for a while doing the math on what Garrett Holloway paying attention to her meant, practically. She came to the same conclusion 3 times, and didn't like it any of the 3 times, but it was the truth of the situation. If he believed the land had value she hadn't publicized yet, he would move on it eventually. He was a man built for patience in his pursuit of things he wanted, and he had more resources than she did, and there were legal mechanisms, water rights challenges, tax disputes, boundary claims, that a wealthy man with a cooperative county official could deploy against a single woman with depleted savings. She was not afraid exactly, but she was alert in a new way after that conversation. She redoubled the fence repairs. She began keeping better records of every hour worked, every animal moved, every section cleared. Not because the records were legally required, but because they established a documented pattern of occupancy and use that would matter if anyone ever tried to argue she had abandoned or neglected the land. She also, quietly, asked Eli's father if he knew a lawyer in the nearest large town. Thinking about legal trouble, Eli's father, whose name was Grant, asked her over the fence one evening. "Thinking about being prepared," she said. He nodded slowly. He was a man who had dealt with enough county bureaucracy to understand the distinction. "There's a man in Harlan named Webb. He's honest. That's the main thing you need." She wrote to Webb that week. She didn't have any specific legal problem yet. She just wanted him to know her situation existed and to have his address in her notebook. The cheese came about by accident. One of the nanny goats, a large-framed animal Eli had named Duchess because of the imperious way she walked, had been producing more milk than the herd dynamics required, and rather than let it go to waste, Clara had started collecting it. She had a rudimentary knowledge of soft cheese from her mother, who had kept a small dairy operation in the years before Clara was old enough to remember clearly, but who had talked about it often enough that some of the practical knowledge had transferred without Clara ever consciously learning it. The first batch was unremarkable. The second was better. The third, which she brought into the general store on a Tuesday in the 5th month and left with Agnes on a trial basis, sold out before Thursday. "I had 4 people ask where it came from," Agnes told her when she came back. 3 of them were people who've never asked me about cheese in their lives. Clara looked at the empty shelf space. "How much did you sell it for?" Agnes named a price. It was higher than Clara had expected. "People here haven't had real soft cheese in 2 years, Agnes said. "The Harlan Dairy stopped delivering last winter." She folded her arms and looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who has been in commerce long enough to recognize a gap in a market. "How much can you make?" "I don't know yet." "Find out." She found out. The calculation was not simple. The herd was still primarily working the brush, and pulling too many animals into milk production would slow the clearing. But there was a middle path that involved managing the herd in 2 groups and rotating them through different functions. It took 3 weeks to figure out the right balance, during which the cheese production was inconsistent and twice went wrong in ways that produced something she threw out rather than sell. But by the end of the 5th month, she was bringing 12 rounds a week into Agnes's store, and Agnes was selling all 12. And the money, not much but real, was going back into her depleted reserve. Eli, who had taken on the milk collection as his morning task before the brushwork started, was deeply proud of this development in a way he didn't express directly. He just started arriving 15 minutes earlier each morning and taking slightly better notes on which animals were producing what. Clara noticed but didn't comment. She had learned that Eli's pride in the operation worked best when you left it alone to function without acknowledgement. The first person to say something mocking to her face about the cheese was a rancher named Cord, who came into the general store while she was restocking the shelf and said, loud enough for the 3 other customers to hear, "Goat cheese, that's the great plan out at Deadthorn Valley. Goat cheese." The other customers offered the expected response, which was a low, appreciative chuckle. Clara stacked the last round and turned around. "It sold out in 2 days last week," Cord shrugged. "Novelty." 4 weeks in a row, she said. "How long does a novelty last?" He didn't have an answer for that, which made it worse for him, so he covered it with another small laugh and walked out. Agnes caught Clara's eye from behind the counter and gave her a very slight nod, the kind that doesn't require words. That evening, Clara walked her property until the light went. She walked the cleared sections and the still uncleared sections, and the ridge with the large flat stone, where the goats had gathered again in the last of the afternoon heat, clustering around the base of the rock formation with the specific focused interest of animals who have identified something they cannot explain. She stood at the edge of the ridge and looked across the 62 acres, the 18 cleared, the 44 still to go, the pale green threading up through the recovered ground below. She thought about Mara's words. She thought about the hollow sound under the stone. She thought about the damp soil in the low section and what it meant if what Mara suspected was right. She had not told anyone about that conversation, not Eli, not Agnes, not even the lawyer Webb she had written to in Harlan. The land was keeping something. She was not ready to stop keeping it for the land. She turned back toward the ridge and looked at the flat stones in the fading light, and the wind came up from the south and moved through the cleared grass below. And in that brief, quiet moment between the end of the workday and the beginning of the night, she felt the particular emotion that does not have a clean name. Not happiness, not certainty, not triumph. Something closer to the feeling of standing on ground that you have begun, slowly, to understand. She went back down to the barn. The goats needed checking, the notes needed writing, and she had an early start tomorrow. There was still a long way to go, and she knew it. But the direction had started to clarify, and that was not nothing. Webb, the lawyer from Harlan, wrote back in the 6th month with a letter that was 3 pages long and careful in the way that honest legal advice is always careful, full of qualifications and conditional statements and phrases like, in the event that and should it become necessary. He had reviewed the property deed she'd sent him, confirmed the mineral rights were solid, noted 2 potential vulnerabilities in the boundary description on the eastern edge that could theoretically be challenged, and recommended she get a proper survey done before anyone else suggested it. The survey cost money she didn't have, so she put it on a list of things to do as soon as she did have it, and in the meantime she kept the letter in the same tin as her emergency cash and tried not to think too hard about the eastern boundary. The cheese money was helping, but helping slowly. 12 rounds a week at Agnes's store had become 16 by the end of the 5th month, and Agnes had started asking for 20, because a restaurant in Harlan had heard about it through some channel Clara hadn't tracked, and sent a man to the store specifically to ask where it came from. Agnes had given him Clara's name and the general direction of Deadthorn Valley, and the man, whose name was Pryor, and who worked for an establishment called the Continental Table, had ridden out on a Wednesday afternoon and stood at her fence and looked at the operation with the particular focused attention of someone who buys things for a living. "How consistent are you?" he asked, after she'd shown him the barn and the milk rotation and the aging process she'd worked out over the past 2 months. "Getting more consistent," she said honestly. "I've had 2 bad batches in the last 8 weeks." He appreciated the honesty, which she could tell because he didn't leave. "What happened with the bad batches?" "Temperature variance in the aging space. I've addressed it." He walked around the aging area again, looked at her records. She showed him the notebook, the dates and weights and notes on each batch. And then he offered her a standing weekly order at a price that made her do the mental math twice before she responded. "I can do that by the end of next month," she said. "Not before." "End of next month is fine." They shook hands at the fence, and he rode back toward Harlan, and Clara stood for a moment after he left doing arithmetic in her head that was, for the first time since she'd signed that bill of sale, something she could call comfortable. Eli came around the corner of the barn with a bucket and stopped when he saw her expression. What happened? We have a restaurant account. He set the bucket down. In Harlan? The Continental Table. He was quiet for a moment, working through the implications. That's a real place. My father's been there. I know. He says it's expensive. It is, she said, which is why they can pay what I need them to pay. Eli picked his bucket back up and continued toward the barn, and then stopped and turned around. Does that mean we're okay? She looked at him. He was 17 and he had worked on this operation for 5 months without pay, and with the cheerful stubbornness of someone who had attached his sense of the future to a project that most people around him considered a joke. He deserved a straight answer. We're getting there, she said. Not okay yet. Getting there. He nodded, satisfied with that, and went back to work. It was in the 6th month that Garrett Holloway came to her property for the first time. She had been expecting some version of this. Agnes's warning had been 3 months ago, and she had felt his attention in the way you feel weather coming, not through any single observable sign, but through a cumulative shift in the atmosphere. His foreman Decker had ridden past the property twice in the past month at times that weren't accidental. One of the hands at the feed store had asked her, with excessive casualness, how the operation was going, and she had recognized the question as someone else's question being delivered at arm's length. Holloway himself arrived on a Tuesday morning alone, which surprised her. She had expected him to bring someone, the foreman or the county official named Briggs, who was known to handle his various administrative needs. Instead, he rode up to her gate on a gray horse and dismounted without being invited, which was the kind of confidence that comes from never having needed an invitation anywhere. She was working on the fence line when she heard the horse and turned to see him coming through the gate. "Mr. Holloway," she said. She didn't put down the fence tool she was holding. "Miss Whitmore." He looked at the cleared sections visible from the gate. Nearly 22 acres now, the grass coming in progressively thicker, a small herd of goats visible at the far edge working the northeast thickets. "You've made progress." "Some." He walked a few steps toward the cleared land and looked at it with the expression of a man reassessing a situation. It was a more honest reaction than she'd expected. He wasn't bothering to conceal his interest, which she wasn't sure whether to read as respect or as the confidence of someone who doesn't feel the need to be strategic yet. "I want to make you an offer," he said. "All right. The land, the operation, fair market value plus a premium for what you've built here." He named a number. It was a good number. Better than she would have gotten from anyone else, better than she'd paid, and it acknowledged that she had done real work here. You could start somewhere else. Fresh capital, no debt, better odds. She looked at him. He was watching her with the patient attention of a man who has made many offers and learned to read the response before it's given. "Why?" she said. "I'm sorry? Why do you want it? You have the largest spread in the county. You have water. You have cattle. What do you want with a goat operation and 62 acres of partially cleared brush?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not irritation exactly, more like the adjustment a person makes when a conversation goes somewhere they didn't fully anticipate. "It's good land," he said, "now that someone's bothered to prove it." "It was good land before I got here," Clara said. "You didn't want it then." "I didn't know what it was then. And now you do." She set her fence tool against the post. "What is it that you think you know, Mr. Holloway?" He looked at her for a long moment. He was not a stupid man, and he was not, she thought, a completely dishonest one. He was a man who had built everything he had through the systematic acquisition and control of resources, and he was applying that same logic to her property because that was the only logic he had. She didn't hate him for it. It was just a fact. "I know the land is producing," he said. "I know you have a restaurant account in Harlan. I know you've cleared 20-plus acres and the grass is coming back. That's more than anyone managed in 11 years. He paused. "I'm offering you a fair exit, Miss Whitmore, before it gets complicated." "Before what gets complicated?" "County assessments, water rights documentation. There are processes involved in formalizing the kind of operation you're building here, and those processes have costs." She understood exactly what he meant. Not a threat, not quite, but a clear map of what kinds of complications could emerge if he decided to be difficult. She picked up her fence tool. "Thank you for the offer," she said. "I'm not selling. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, once, and walked back to his horse. "Think about it," he said from the saddle. "I have," she said. "No, thank you." He rode out, and she watched him go. And then she stood at the fence for a minute with her hands wrapped around the tool and her heart moving faster than she would have liked. Not fear. Something adjacent to fear, which was the recognition that the situation had shifted, and that the shift was going to require her to do things she hadn't budgeted for. She went inside and wrote to Webb that afternoon. She described the conversation in exact detail. She told him what Holloway had implied about county assessments and water rights, and she asked him to explain precisely what leverage existed in those areas and what it would cost to protect against it. Webb wrote back in 10 days. The letter was 4 pages and considerably less reassuring than the first one. 2 weeks after Holloway's visit, the goats found the well. Or more accurately, the goats confirmed what Mara had suspected 4 months ago, in a way that was no longer possible to ignore. It was Eli who came to get her. He found her in the aging barn checking the weekly batch and said, with a restraint that meant he was working hard to stay calm, "You need to come see what General is doing." General, the large dominant male who had spent 6 months asserting his importance over the rest of the herd, was on the ridge at the large flat stone formation, and he was doing something Clara had never seen a goat do. He was tapping the surface of the largest stone with his front hoof, repeatedly, with the methodical focus of an animal who has located something and is trying to get to it. Around him, a dozen other goats had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, some of them also pressing their noses to the base of the stone, sniffing with concentrated intensity. Clara stood at the edge of the ridge and watched for a minute. Then she walked up and put her own hand on the stone and tapped, the way Mara had done 4 months ago. The hollow sound was more pronounced now, or maybe she was listening differently. "Eli," she said, "go get the pry bar from the barn. The long one." "Are we—" "Get the pry bar." It took them most of the morning. The stone was large, maybe 4 feet across and 2 feet thick, and it had settled into the ground over what must have been many decades, the edges embedded in compacted clay. They worked around it with the pry bar and a shorter iron bar she used for fence posts, moving it in increments, stopping twice when Claire's back gave out from the angle of the work, and she had to straighten up and walk around for a few minutes before she could continue. The goats watched with great interest, pressing close enough that she had to keep pushing General back with her elbow, which he took as an invitation to press closer. "Get back," she told him, not unkindly. He considered this and stepped back approximately 4 inches. When the stone finally came free, tipping sideways with a grinding scrape that sent the watching goats scattering in alarm, the smell hit them first, cool and mineral and entirely different from the dry, hot air of the ridge. A cold exhale from underground, like the earth had been holding its breath. The opening was roughly 2 feet across, irregular, surrounded by fitted stones that were clearly hand-placed, dry stacked limestone in a circular pattern that disappeared downward into the dark. Clara lay flat on the ridge and pushed her arm in as far as it would go, and felt cold air rising and, after a moment, a faint sound that it took her 3 full seconds to identify. Water. Moving water, very far below. She pulled her arm back and sat up and looked at Eli. He was crouching on the other side of the opening, staring down into it, and his expression was the expression of a 17-year-old who has just understood that something extremely significant has happened and is not sure what to do with his face. "Is that—" he started. "Yes," she said. "An underground—" "Yes." He sat back on his heels and looked at the opening and then at her. "How deep?" "I don't know. Deep." She stood up and brushed the clay off her front. "We need a rope and something to lower down. And we need to not tell anyone about this yet." He looked at her sharply. "Why not?" She looked across the property, the cleared acres below, the line of green coming up through the recovered ground, the thickets still to be worked, and below all of it some current of underground water that had been sitting here in the dark while everyone in the valley argued about who owned the drought. "Because I need to know what I have before anyone else does," she said. "And because once people know, everything changes. And I'm not ready for everything to change yet." Eli thought about this. He was a practical boy, and the practicality of it reached him. "Okay," he said. "Who else knows about this?" "Mara suspected it. I'm going to go see her today." He nodded. He looked at the opening one more time, the cold air still moving through it in that steady, impossible exhale. "General figured it out," he said. "He did. Should have named him something smarter." Despite everything, Clara laughed. It came out louder than she intended, and General, who had sidled back to the edge of the opening, startled and backed up 3 feet with an expression of profound offense. She replaced the stone as best she could, wedged it back into position, and walked down from the ridge with Eli and went to find Mara Chitset. Mara came out to the property the next morning and descended a rope into the well opening with a calm that Clara found slightly alarming. She was down there for nearly 20 minutes with a lantern attached to a second rope, while Clara and Eli stood at the lip and listened to the sounds from below, the scrape of rope against stone, the faint splash of Mara testing the water depth, an occasional muttered comment that didn't make it up to the surface intact. When she came up, her hands were wet to the elbow, and her face was expressionless in the way of someone processing something important before they speak about it. "It's good water," she said, sitting at the edge of the opening and wringing her sleeve. "Clean, cold. There's a flow. It's not standing water. It's fed from somewhere. The depth to the water surface is about 30 feet. Below that I couldn't measure, but there's a lot of it." She looked at Clara. "Someone built this well a long time ago and then covered it, deliberately. Why would anyone cover a well? I don't know. Conflict over ownership, maybe. Someone didn't want it found or wanted it preserved for later." Mara looked at the fitted stone ring around the opening. "This stonework is old. Older than the valley's been settled in the current sense." Clara sat with that for a moment. "What do I do with it?" "Right now, nothing," Mara said immediately. "You document it. You write to Webb, and you tell him exactly what you found, and you get him to establish clearly that it is on your property and belongs to your land title. You get the survey done. You need that boundary documentation before anything else happens." She paused. "And you be very careful about who finds out. Holloway came to offer me a buyout 2 weeks ago." Mara looked at her with a specific expression that Clara had come to recognize as the older woman's version of significant concern. "What did he say?" Clara told her. "All of it. The offer, the implied threat about county processes, what Webb had written about water rights vulnerability." Mara was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't know about the well." "I don't think so." "Then he's operating on speculation. He sees the land producing and he wants it before he fully understands why." She picked up her lantern and stood. "If he finds out about the well before you have your legal position secured, Clara, he will come at this very hard. He has a county official in his pocket and enough legal resources to delay and obstruct for years. You might win eventually, but winning eventually can cost you everything in the meantime." "I know. Then move fast." Clara moved fast. She wrote to Webb that same evening. A long letter, precise and detailed, describing the well, its approximate dimensions, the stonework, the water quality as Mara had assessed it, the location on the property relative to the boundary markers. She asked him what she needed to do, in what order, and what it was going to cost. She also asked him what water rights in this county attached to a documented underground source discovered on private land. Webb's answer came back in 8 days, and it was the most useful thing he had ever sent her. The answer to her last question, stripped of the legal language, was, "In this county, an underground water source discovered on private land belonged to the landowner, provided the land title was clear and uncontested, and the source was properly documented before any competing claim was filed." The critical phrase was "before any competing claim was filed." She had the survey done within the week, paying for it by pulling the money she'd been saving toward a second aging barn and telling herself the barn could wait. The surveyor was a meticulous man named Harker, who had been doing boundary work in the county for 23 years and who asked no questions about why she needed it done quickly. He spent 2 days on the property, and when he was done, the eastern boundary that Webb had flagged as potentially vulnerable was documented and confirmed as Clara's by 11 feet. 11 feet. She paid Harker and shook his hand and filed the survey with the county land registry the same afternoon. She did all of this quietly, moving through the administrative steps the way you move through a problem when you know someone else might be paying attention. Carefully, without drawing notice, without signaling what she was doing or why. The well stayed covered. The stone was replaced each evening, She and Eli had an unspoken agreement that the ridge was off limits to discussion in any context where someone outside the property might hear. But the valley was dry, and dry valleys talk. The summer heat arrived 3 weeks after the well was found, and it arrived in the particular way of a drought year. Not gradually, but like something that had been waiting on the other side of a door and simply walked through. The creek on Holloway's northern ridge, which had run reliably for as long as anyone in Dustfall could remember, dropped to less than half its normal flow within 2 weeks. Wells that had never given trouble began pulling slow. The Carter grain operation lost a third of its early yield to heat stress. Ranchers started buying water from the county depot at prices that were painful and rising. Clara's property was different. The low section where the grass had come in thickest stayed green when everything around it browned. Her animals had no water trouble. The cheese production held steady because the goats were healthy and the conditions in the aging barn were stable. People noticed. Of course they noticed. In a drought, you notice where things are not dying. Cord, who had made the cheese comment in the general store 4 months ago, stopped at her fence on a Thursday morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was the particular combination of pride being managed and need being felt. "Your land looks different from mine," he said. "It's the grass cover," Clara said carefully. "Holds moisture better than bare ground." He looked at the green section in the low ground. "That's more than grass cover." She didn't answer that. He turned his hat in his hands once. "My cattle are struggling," he said. "Water's not enough. I've got 43 head and they're going to start dropping if this doesn't break in the next 3 weeks." She looked at him. He had laughed at her at the auction. He had laughed at her in the general store. He was not a bad man, just the kind of person who defaults to mockery in the presence of something he doesn't understand, and who regrets it later when the understanding arrives. "I hear you," she said. "I'm not asking for charity," he said quickly. If you have water you're not using, I'll think about it," she said. "Give me a few days." He nodded and left, and Clara stood at the fence and watched the dried-out landscape beyond her property line, and thought about what Mara had told her about moving carefully, and what Webb had said about competing claims, and what Garrett Holloway had implied about county processes, and what was sitting 30 feet below the ridge on the highest point of her property. She was not ready. The documentation was filed, the survey was done, but Webb had advised her to hold off on making any formal declaration about the water source until he'd received copies of everything and had time to prepare the supporting filings. That was going to take another 2 weeks at minimum. She didn't have 2 weeks. The valley was drying up around her. And somewhere on the other side of that calculation, Garrett Holloway was watching the drought take hold of his neighbor's land with the satisfied attention of a man who has water and knows what water is worth when everyone else is running out of it. She had one chance to get this right, and she had to get it right the first time. She went up to the ridge that evening after Eli had gone home and stood next to the covered well in the last of the light. The air coming up from beneath the stone was cool against her ankles, and somewhere far below the water was running in the dark. She stood there for a long time, thinking. By the time the light was gone, she had made up her mind. Not about everything. She still needed Webb's clearance, still needed the formal documentation in place, but about the direction, about what she was going to do when the moment came, and what kind of person she was going to be when it did. She replaced the stone carefully and walked back down the ridge to close up the barn, and the night came down over the valley, dry and hot and waiting. Webb's letter arrived on a Monday, 9 days after she had sent him the survey documentation and her description of the well. She was in the barn when Eli brought it up from town, and she wiped her hands on her work cloth and read it standing up because she didn't want to wait the 20 steps it would take to reach a chair. The letter was 3 pages. The first page confirmed what she needed to know. The survey was clean, the title was uncontested, and the documented underground water source on her property was, under county law, legally and entirely hers. Webb had filed the supporting registration with the county land office that same week, meaning the claim was now on record. Any competing petition filed after that date would face the full weight of her prior documentation. The second page was about Garrett Holloway. Webb had done some asking around, carefully, through channels that didn't connect back to Clara. What he had found was not surprising, but was specific enough to be useful. Holloway had approached County Assessor Briggs twice in the past month. The first conversation had been about reassessing the property value of Dead Thorn Valley for tax purposes, a process that, if initiated, could result in a significantly higher tax burden that might strain Clara's finances. The second conversation, which Webb's source described as less formal and more pointed, had been about the county's authority to claim eminent domain over water sources determined to be of public necessity during declared drought conditions. Clara read that paragraph twice. The third page was Webb's recommendation: move before Holloway does. Declare the water source formally, establish the terms of access publicly, and do it in a context that makes any subsequent legal challenge look like what it would be: a wealthy man trying to take water from a community that needs it. Timing is everything here, Webb had written, in the blunt, plain language he used when he wanted to make sure she understood. If you act first and publicly, you control the narrative. If Holloway acts first through Briggs, you spend the next year fighting in county court at significant expense while the valley dries up around you. I recommend you not give him the first move. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and stood in the barn doorway looking out at the property. The day was already hot at 8 in the morning, the kind of heat that had no relief built into it, that just sat on the land and pressed down. The recovered sections were still green. The grass cover and the slow upwelling from below were doing exactly what Mara had said they would. But beyond her fence line, the landscape was the color of old straw. Eli was waiting at the fence. He had not asked to read the letter, which she appreciated. "We need to build a well casing," she said. "Something proper. Timber frame, rope, and bucket mechanism, the whole structure." He looked at her for a moment. "We're opening it." "We're opening it." "When?" "Before the end of the week." He was quiet, doing the mental math on the labor involved. They had cleared 31 acres by now, and the goats still needed daily management, and the cheese production had a Thursday rotation that couldn't slip. "I'll ask my father for help," he said. "Tell him what it's for." "He'll want to know." "I know. Tell him." Grant Carter came the next morning with 2 of his older sons, and they worked 3 days on the ridge, building the well structure with the focused efficiency of men who understood that what they were building mattered. Claire had bought the timber from the Dustfall lumber yard, another hit to the reserve, added to the survey cost and Webb's fees, so that her financial position was now tighter than it had been at any point since the first month. She did the math at night, and it held, barely, if the restaurant account paid on time and the cheese batch this week came out right. The batch came out right. The restaurant paid on time. On Thursday afternoon, the well casing was complete. A solid timber frame over the stone-lined shaft, a hand-turned windlass, a rope that reached the water surface 30 feet down, and a cedar bucket that came up full and cold and clear on the first pull. Clara held the bucket in both hands and looked at the water. It was the best-looking water she had ever seen, which was a ridiculous thing to think about water. But it was true. Cold and clear and slightly mineral, the kind of water that tasted like it had been traveling a long way to reach you. Eli drank from it first because he was 17 and couldn't help himself. He stood there with water running down his chin and said, "That's good." "It is," she said. Grant Carter stood back from the structure with his arms folded and looked at it with the expression of a man who has just built something he understands the significance of. He looked at Clara. "What are you going to do with it?" "Share it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Holloway won't like that." "I know. He's been telling people around town that the county is going to need to regulate any new water source found during the drought. That access can't just be—" Grant paused, choosing his words. "He's been setting it up, the story, that this needs to be managed through official channels." "Whose official channels?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Grant looked at the well again. "Briggs was at the feed store yesterday. That man goes wherever Holloway points him." Clara had expected this. She had, in fact, expected it enough that she had spoken to Webb by telegraph that morning, a short exchange, expensive but necessary, and had his confirmation that her legal position was solid and that any county intervention attempted after her formal declaration would face significant procedural barriers. Briggs could be pointed, but he could not be aimed fast enough to catch what she was about to do. "I'm going to need your help," she said to Grant, "and I need it in the next 2 days." He looked at her steadily. He was a man who had watched his youngest son spend 5 months working without pay because he believed in this operation, and who had seen from across the property line what Clara had actually built here. What do you need? She sent word through Agnes. This was the right channel, and she had known it for months. Agnes was the information architecture of Dustfall, in the same way that the general store was the physical architecture. Things moved through her with accuracy and without distortion, because Agnes was not a gossip in the careless sense, but a communicator in the precise one. She told people what they needed to know, and she told it straight. Clara went to the store on a Friday morning and told Agnes she was opening the well on Sunday and inviting anyone with water needs to come to the property and discuss terms of access. She described the water, its quality, its volume as Mara had estimated it, its consistency through the drought conditions, in the plain factual terms that Agnes would relay correctly. Agnes listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "How is Holloway going to respond to this?" "I don't know exactly," Clara said. "But I know he's been talking to Briggs about County Water Management Authority, and I know he wants control of any new water source found in the valley." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "And if Briggs shows up Sunday with papers?" "He can show up with whatever he likes," Clara said. "I have documentation. The water belongs to the land and the land belongs to me. That's filed and dated, and Webb is prepared to back it." She paused. "What I need is for enough people to be there that whatever Holloway does in response, he does it in front of witnesses." Agnes absorbed this. "You're using community presence as protection." "Yes." Agnes looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded, once, and turned back to her counter. "I'll make sure people know," she said. "Sunday morning?" 9 o'clock. "I'll be there myself," Agnes said, "and I'll bring my account books, in case anyone needs to talk terms on the spot." Clara hadn't asked for that. She felt something move in her chest that was not quite sentimentality, but was somewhere in its neighborhood. "Thank you, Agnes." "Don't thank me. Just make sure the water's as good as you say it is." "It's better," Clara said. "Well, Saturday brought the first real test. Holloway's foreman Decker arrived at her gate in the mid-morning, which she had expected, but he arrived with a man she hadn't seen before. Not Briggs, but a younger man in a town suit who introduced himself as Holloway's land attorney and whose name was Calder. Clara met them at the gate. She did not open it. Calder spoke first, with the practiced smoothness of someone whose job is to deliver bad news in a way that makes it sound like an offer. "Miss Whitmore, we're here on behalf of Mr. Holloway regarding the water source recently identified on your property. Given the drought conditions and the county's interest in equitable resource management—" "Stop," Clara said. Calder stopped. "You're going to tell me that the county has authority to regulate access to water sources during a declared drought emergency, and that Mr. Holloway, as the region's primary agricultural operator, has an interest in coordinating that management." She looked at him evenly. "Is that roughly correct?" Calder blinked. He had the look of a man whose speech has been interrupted before it found its rhythm. "The specifics are somewhat more nuanced. Mr. Calder, I filed formal documentation of the water source with the county land office 11 days ago. That filing predates any action by Assessor Briggs or any other county official by more than a week. My attorney in Harlan is prepared to address any competing claim in detail." She paused. "I am opening the well to community access on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, on terms I will set, because the water is on my land and it belongs to me. If Mr. Holloway has a legal objection to that, he is welcome to bring it before a judge." She said all of this clearly and without raising her voice, which was harder than it sounded because her heart was doing the same thing it had done on the day she signed the bill of sale, hammering with a force that made her feel it in her throat. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head since Wednesday, and it was almost exactly as rehearsed, which was both reassuring and slightly surreal. Calder looked at Decker. Decker, who was not a stupid man, was looking at Clara with an expression that had shifted from the professional blank he'd arrived with to something more like reluctant attention. "Mr. Holloway will want to discuss this directly," Calder said. "He's welcome to come Sunday morning," Clara said, "along with everyone else." She went inside and closed the gate. Her hands, once she was out of sight, were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat on the table until they stopped, then wrote a short telegraph to Webb informing him of the conversation, and then she went back to work because there was still work to do, and standing around being anxious about Sunday was not going to help anything. Sunday arrived the way that important days sometimes do, ordinary in its weather, nothing atmospheric to signal the significance of what was happening. Clear sky, already warm at 8, a dry wind coming from the south. By 8:30, people were already arriving. Clara had not fully anticipated the number. She had thought maybe 15, 20 people. The most directly affected ranchers and farmers, a few curious townspeople. By 9 o'clock, there were close to 50 people gathered at the base of the ridge on her property, and more coming up the road. Cord was there, with 2 of his ranch hands. The Carter family was there in force, Grant and his wife and all 3 of his sons. Families she recognized from the general store, from the feed supply, from the road to Harlan. Agnes was there with her account books under her arm and her reading glasses on her head. Mara had driven out from her place and was standing near the back of the gathering with her arms folded, watching with the quiet attention of someone who has been part of this story since the beginning and wants to see how it ends. Clara stood on the low ridge near the well structure and looked at the crowd and felt the particular sensation of having prepared for something, and then finding that the something was larger than the preparation. She was not a natural public speaker. She had never stood in front of 50 people and said anything significant, and for a moment the scale of it pressed on her in a way that made her want to take a step back. She didn't take a step back. She had written notes. She didn't use them. "Thank you for coming," she said, loudly enough to carry to the back of the gathering. "Most of you know what this is about. There's a well on this property that I documented and registered 8 days ago. The water is clean, consistent, and adequate for the valley's needs during this drought. I'm going to tell you what I've decided to do with it, and then you can ask questions." The crowd was quiet. It was the particular quiet of people who are paying attention. "I'm making the water available on 3 terms," she said. "If you can pay, you pay a fair rate per barrel. I'll tell you the number, and you'll see it's reasonable. If you can't pay cash but you can work, we negotiate what the work is worth, and you credit it against water access. If you genuinely cannot do either, families in direct need, people who are at the end of their resources, you get water without cost." She paused. "That's it. Those are the terms." The crowd absorbed this. She heard murmuring, but not the kind that meant objection. It was the sound of people recalculating, adjusting a picture they'd had of how this was going to go. Cord spoke up from the middle of the gathering. "What's the rate per barrel?" She named it. She had worked out the number with Agnes earlier in the week, below what the county depot was charging, enough below that it would be immediately meaningful to people whose operations were strained. Someone near the back said, "That's less than Briggs charges." "Yes," Clara said. More murmuring. This time it had a different tone. And then Garrett Holloway walked through the gate. He had not come alone this time. He had Calder on one side and Briggs on the other. Briggs, who was the county assessor, a soft-faced man of about 55 who dressed carefully and moved with the particular deliberate pace of someone who understands that his authority exists in the pauses between actions. Behind them were 2 other men Clara didn't recognize. The crowd parted slightly to let them through, not out of deference, but out of the instinctive spatial rearrangement that happens when something significant enters a room. Holloway walked to the front of the gathering and stopped maybe 10 feet from where Clara was standing on the low ridge. He looked at her, then at the well structure, then at the crowd. He was reading the situation with the same practiced efficiency she had seen in him at the auction, that quick, accurate assessment of where things stood. She watched him understand that he was too late. Not legally. She'd already won that. But in the more fundamental sense. 50 people standing on Clara Whitmore's land on a Sunday morning, people who needed water and had just been offered it on terms they could actually meet, were not going to respond well to a wealthy man arriving with a government official to tell them the situation was more complicated than it looked. The politics of it were beyond Holloway's control in a way that his money and his official relationships couldn't reach, because the people standing in this gathering were not abstractions to be managed through legal processes. They were his neighbors, and they were watching him. Briggs started to step forward, and Holloway put a hand on his arm. Briggs stopped. Holloway looked at Clara for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated. Not defeat exactly, but the adjustment a man makes when he has to recalculate not just his strategy, but his understanding of a situation. She had seen that adjustment begin when Calder returned from Saturday's gate conversation, she guessed. He had been recalculating since then. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was even. Whatever he was feeling, he was not going to show it in front of 50 people. "You've established a water access program. I have. On your terms. On fair terms, she said, which I've made public. He looked at the crowd again, then back at her. The county will need to be satisfied that public health standards are met. Briggs has the authority to require water quality testing. Clara had expected this. Webb had expected this. I'll welcome a county water quality inspection, she said. I'll provide full access to the site for testing purposes. If there are standards that need to be met, I'll meet them. She paused. In the meantime, the water doesn't stop. Holloway held her gaze. The crowd was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that has a weight to it. You know this isn't over, he said. Not a threat exactly. More like a statement of fact from a man who was deciding how to continue from a position he hadn't anticipated being in. I expect it's not, Clara said. But today, this is what's happening. Anyone who needs water is welcome to it. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back, said something quiet to Calder, and walked out the gate with Briggs and his 2 men behind him. Calder followed last, not quite quickly enough to avoid the expressions on the faces of people who watched them leave. The crowd exhaled collectively. It was not a cheer. It was quieter than that and more real. People began moving toward the well, toward Agnes with her account books, toward each other in the small conversations of people working out practical details. Cord found Clara at the edge of the gathering and stood beside her for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, I was wrong about you. She looked at him. He had the look of a man saying something he'd been sitting with for a while. You weren't wrong, she said. You just hadn't seen enough yet. He nodded slowly like he was deciding whether that was better or worse than being told he'd simply been wrong. Then he went to talk to Agnes about the barrel rates. Eli appeared at Clara's elbow. He had been managing the well mechanism all morning, raising and lowering the cedar bucket with the focused attention he brought to everything. And his arms were tired and his shirt was wet with sweat, and he was grinning in the barely contained way of someone who is trying to be professionally calm about something that is, in fact, remarkable. General keeps trying to get to the front of the line, he said. That sounds right, Clara said. Mrs. Aldis's family is here from Harlan. They drove 2 hours. She hadn't known that. She looked at the crowd, at the faces she recognized and the ones she didn't, at the line that had formed at the well, at Agnes processing accounts with her glasses on and her pen moving, at Mara still at the back of the gathering, now talking to Grant Carter with her arms uncrossed and her expression something close to satisfied. A woman Clara didn't know well, one of the farming families from the east side of the valley, stopped beside her with a child on her hip and said, simply, "Thank you." Not expansive, just that. Clara nodded. She didn't trust her voice entirely at that moment, which was a problem she had not anticipated and dealt with by looking at the well structure and the line of people and the cleared land below the ridge. 31 acres of recovered ground, green where everything else had gone to straw, until the feeling passed enough to manage. The water kept coming up cold and clear in the cedar bucket, steady as the source that fed it, 30 feet down in the dark. The week after the opening was the hardest administrative week of Clara's life, and also the most productive. Webb came up from Harlan on Tuesday, in person, for the first time, a thin, precise man in his early 50s who walked the property with his hands behind his back and asked questions in the methodical way of someone building a legal structure from the ground up. He examined the well documentation, reviewed the water access records Agnes had helped her start on Sunday, and sat at her small table for 2 hours going through the implications of Holloway's likely next moves. He'll try the water quality route first, Webb said. Briggs can initiate a county inspection, and the inspection process can be slowed. 30, 60 days, potentially. Can they shut down access during the inspection? They can try. Whether a judge would grant it, given the drought conditions and the public access you've already established. Webb tilted his head. 50 people on record as having used the water, Agnes's account books. That's a public interest argument that's hard to override in a drought year. He paused. I'd say no. They can't shut it down cleanly, but they'll try to slow it. They'll try. And Holloway may also go after the restaurant account. The Continental Table has a county business license that Briggs's office processes. It's a soft target if he wants to apply pressure indirectly. Clara had thought about this. She had not told Pryor at the Continental Table any of what was happening. She had decided that was not his problem to carry. But she had drafted a letter to him that week explaining the situation in straightforward terms and letting him decide whether to continue the account with full knowledge of the circumstances. It was the honest thing to do, and she had learned in the past 7 months that the honest thing, done early, was almost always better than the convenient thing done late. Pryor wrote back within 4 days. The letter was short. We're not in the business of dropping suppliers because someone powerful is unhappy with them. Keep sending the cheese? She kept sending the cheese. The county inspection came the following Thursday. 2 men from Briggs's office arrived with equipment and clipboards and the particular bureaucratic energy of people performing a process they didn't personally design. They spent 3 hours at the well. They tested the water, measured the shaft dimensions, examined the stone casing, wrote things down. They were professional and thorough and gave nothing away about their conclusions. The report came back 10 days later. The water met all applicable county standards. No restrictions were recommended. Briggs signed it. Whatever Holloway had said to him in private, Briggs was apparently not willing to falsify a public health document over it, which Clara acknowledged to herself was a form of integrity she hadn't fully expected from him. She filed the inspection report with the water access documentation and wrote to Webb telling him about it. His reply was brief. Good. Now the hard part is over, and the long part begins. It was Mara who named what had actually happened in the plainest terms when she visited the property a week after the inspection result came in. They were sitting on the low ridge near the well in the late afternoon. After a day of work, Clara could feel in every muscle, and Mara had a tin cup of the well water in her hands and was looking at the cleared sections below. Now 31 acres, green and recovering, the grass thick enough in the lowest section that you could sit in it without seeing bare ground. You know what you actually did, Mara said. It wasn't a question. I made water available. You made yourself impossible to remove. Mara looked at her. That's the thing Holloway didn't understand. He thought this was about the land, or the water, or the money. But you built something he can't buy out from under you because it's not in the soil. She gestured toward the road, where 2 wagons were visible heading toward the property for evening water collection. It's in 50 people who needed something and know who provided it. That's not a transaction he can reverse. Clara looked at the wagons, at the line of green below them, at the ridge where the well casing stood solid in the late light. I still have a lot of debt, she said. Yes, Mara agreed, and Holloway hasn't given up. No, he's patient. He'll find another angle. I know. Mara drank from the cup. How are you sleeping? Clara thought about it. Better than I was. Good. Mara handed her the empty cup. The hard thing about doing something right is that it doesn't actually solve everything. It just puts you in a better position to deal with what comes next. Clara turned the cup in her hands. Outside the gate, one of the wagons had stopped and she could hear a man's voice. She thought it was Cord, talking to Eli about the barrel arrangement. She could hear Eli's voice answering, patient and precise, the way he'd gotten about all of it. He had grown up several years in the past 7 months, and she had watched it happen, which was one of the things about this whole undertaking that she hadn't anticipated and didn't quite know how to account for. The evening light was long and flat, and the valley below was the colors of late summer, brown and gold in the unrecovered sections, green where her work had reached. The property line was visible from here, and beyond it, the landscape was the dry straw color of the drought, and within it, the recovered ground was an island of something else. It wasn't enough. Not yet. There were still 31 acres of thicket to clear. There were still Holloway's lawyers and Briggs's office, and Webb's fees, and the survey debt, and the timber cost of the well casing. There was still the question of what next winter would bring, and whether the restaurant account would hold, and whether the drought would break before it took more of what people had left. There was still everything that the long part meant, but the water was clean and cold, and it was there, and people who needed it were getting it, and her land was green in a dry valley, and she had not sold it, and she had not been moved from it, and when Garrett Holloway had walked out her gate on Sunday morning, he had done it because there was nothing left to do that could reach her there. That was enough for one evening. She set the tin cup down and went to help Eli with the barrels. Holloway's next move came not through Briggs or through Calder, but through something Clara hadn't fully prepared for. Time. Webb had warned her about this. He's patient, Mara had said, and she had been right in a way that Clara now understood more concretely. Holloway didn't come back with another legal angle after the inspection report cleared. He didn't send Decker to the fence line or called her to the gate. He simply went quiet, and the quiet had a quality to it that was more deliberate than the absence of action. He was waiting for the drought to do what his lawyers hadn't managed to do, wear her down to the point where selling became the only remaining option. The drought did not break in September. It did not break in October. The creek on Holloway's northern ridge dropped to a trickle by the first week of November, which was later in the year than anyone could remember it running that low. His cattle operation was contracting. She heard this through Agnes, who heard it through the ordinary commerce of a town where everyone eventually needed something from the general store. He had sold off a third of his herd at poor prices in September rather than pay to water them through the fall. His foreman Decker had left to work a ranch in the next county. These were not catastrophic losses for a man of Holloway's resources, but they were real, and they were the kind of real that accumulates. Clara's property was an exception to the landscape in a way that had stopped being remarkable to her because she was inside it every day. But that she understood was remarkable when she drove into Dustfall and looked at the valley from the road. The low section was still green. The well was still producing at the same rate it had produced since July, which Mara had explained was the nature of a deep-fed underground source. It didn't respond to surface conditions the way a shallow well did. It had its own logic, deeper and slower and less affected by what was happening on the surface. 51 people in operations had used the water access through the fall. Agnes kept the records and Clara reviewed them every week. The cash payments, the labor credits, the names in the no-cost column that she kept separate and didn't discuss publicly. The Harlan restaurant account was still running. The cheese production had expanded to 22 rounds a week, and she had hired a woman named Ruth to help with the aging process. A widow from the east side of town who was precise and reliable, and who had shown up one morning asking if there was work, and who had been there every Thursday since. The finances were not comfortable. They were stable, which was different, and the difference mattered. She had paid Webb's fees through the summer and fall. She had paid off the well-casing timber. The survey debt was gone. What remained was the original purchase cost, which she was working down slowly, and the ongoing operating costs, which the cheese account and the water income were covering with a small margin that she tracked carefully and did not spend carelessly. She was not getting rich. She was building something, which is a different process and a slower one, and, in her experience, considerably more demanding on every level. It was in the second week of November that Holloway came to see her for the second time. Again alone, again without announcement, though this time he knocked at the gate rather than walking through it. It was a small difference, and she noted it. She was in the barn when Eli came to find her. "Holloway at the gate," he said, with the flat neutrality of someone reporting a weather condition. She set down what she was doing and went to the gate and looked at him across the fence. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him up close. Leaner, she thought, and something in his face had recalibrated since the summer. Not diminished exactly, but adjusted. Like a man who has spent several months rethinking a situation and has arrived somewhere new. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Holloway." He looked at the property behind her, the barn, the well on the ridge, the cleared land below, the goats moving in their current rotation through the northwest section. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man seeing something he has been thinking about for a long time. "My lawyer's fees through this summer were significant," he said. It was an unusual way to begin a conversation, and she understood it as an unusual kind of admission. "I imagine mine were too," she said. "I expect we've both spent money on this that we'd have been better off spending elsewhere." He said it without particular bitterness. Just factual. "Probably." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "When you opened the well in July, when you set those terms," he paused, "you could have charged what the market would bear. With the drought, that would have been significant. Instead, you priced it below the county depot." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him. It was a genuine question, she thought, not strategic. He actually wanted to understand it, because it was the part of her behavior that had not fit into any model he had for how people operate when they have something valuable and other people need it. "Because the point wasn't to make as much as I could," she said. "The point was to be here in 10 years. And 20. And you can't be somewhere for 20 years if the people around you resent you for how you treated them when they needed something." She paused. "Also because it was the right thing to do, and I generally try to do that when I can figure out what it is." He absorbed this. That's not how I've operated, he said. I know. It's worked for me. Up to a point. I think that's probably right, she said. Up to a point. He looked at the property one more time. Then he looked at her with the particular directness of a man who has decided to say the thing he actually came to say. I'm not going to pursue any further legal or administrative action regarding the well or your water access program. I want you to know that directly, not through lawyers. She studied his face. He meant it, she thought. Not out of generosity exactly, but out of the honest recognition of a man who has calculated his position and found that the pursuit is costing more than the objective is worth. That was its own kind of honesty. I appreciate you telling me, she said. I also want to ask... He stopped. It cost him something to continue. She could see that. My remaining cattle. I have 63 head. The creek is not going to last the winter at current levels. I want to purchase water access. At your posted rate. No special arrangement. At her posted rate. Not below it, not above it. At the same rate she charged Cord and the Carter family and every other operation in the valley that was paying. She opened the gate. Come and look at the operation, she said. Then we can talk about volume and schedule. He came through the gate and she walked him around the property. The barn, the aging space, the cleared sections, the ridge with the well. He walked it with his hands in his coat pockets and said little. At the well he looked down into the shaft for a long time, and she let him look. How deep did you say the water surface is? He asked. 30 feet to the water. Below that we haven't fully measured, but it's substantial. Maravos estimated the source volume at, well, more than the valley needs, more than the whole valley needs. He straightened up and looked at her. More than the whole valley. That's her estimate. I trust her estimates. He was quiet for a moment. You've been providing to over 50 operations. 51 through October. He nodded slowly. And you never ran short. Not once. He looked out at the cleared land, the green low section, the property that had been called Dead Thorn Valley for 11 years, and that now had a different character entirely. Not transformed into something unrecognizable, but revealed as something it had always been underneath the surface. Patient land. Land that had been waiting for someone to clear enough of the obstruction to let it be what it was. I misjudged you, he said. Not an apology, just a fact, stated without embellishment. You misjudged the land, she said. I was just the person who didn't. He looked at her, and for a moment something in his face was more unguarded than she had ever seen it. He was 60 years old, she guessed, or close to it, and he had spent 40 of those years being the most powerful man in this valley, and whatever it felt like to stand on someone else's land in a drought and ask to buy water at the posted rate, she did not find satisfaction in that. She found it human, which was a different thing. He was a man who had gotten things wrong, and was standing in the evidence of it, and that was something she understood more than she might have expected. Agnes's account books, she said. Go see her tomorrow morning, and she'll set up the arrangement. Bring your schedule for how many head you're running and when you'll need delivery. He nodded. Thank you. Same terms as everyone else, she said, and meant it in both directions. Not better, not worse. He walked back to his horse at the gate and rode out, and Clara stood at the fence and watched him go. Eli came up beside her after a moment. Did he just... Was that... He's going to buy water, she said. Eli was quiet for a moment, processing. How do you feel about that? She thought about it honestly. Like it's the right outcome, she said. Not a victory, just the right outcome. Eli considered this. Is there a difference? Yes, she said. A victory means someone lost. This is just everyone getting what they need. She turned back toward the barn. Come on, the Thursday batch needs checking. The rain came in December. Not the gentle return of moisture that people hope for after a drought, but a genuine rain. 3 days of it, starting on a Tuesday and running through Thursday, the kind of rain that fills things. The creek on Holloway's Ridge came back to half its normal flow within a week. The county water depot dropped its prices. People who had been drawing from Clara's well reduced their frequency, which was exactly what she had expected and planned for. The water income decreased. The land income, the cheese account, the restaurant arrangement, those continued. She stood in the doorway of the barn on the second day of rain and watched it come down on the cleared sections of her land, on the green low ground that had stayed green all through the drought. on the ridge where the well stood solid in the gray weather. And she felt something that she would have had difficulty describing accurately to another person, but that was close to the feeling of having made a correct bet over a very long time period and finally seeing the confirmation of it. Not triumphant, because the bet had cost too much and demanded too much for triumph to be the right word, but settled. Deeply, specifically settled. Ruth came up beside her in the doorway with 2 tin cups of coffee and handed her one without comment. Ruth had been on the property for 2 months by then and had developed the particular communication style of someone who has learned that Clara does not require conversation to feel accompanied. They stood in the doorway and drank their coffee and watched the rain. "Good for the grass," Ruth said eventually. "Very good," Clara said. Ruth nodded and went back to the aging barn. Clara stayed in the doorway a while longer. She thought about what Mara had said on the ridge in the late summer. The hard thing about doing something right is that it doesn't actually solve everything. It just puts you in a better position to deal with what comes next. She had been turning that over in her mind for months, not because she disagreed with it, but because she was still working out what it meant for how you were supposed to feel about what you'd done. It didn't give you rest, it gave you standing. And standing, it turned out, was more useful than rest, even if rest was what your body wanted after 7 months of the kind of work this had been. The thing she had not expected, the thing no calculation had prepared her for, was the texture of being known in a place. She had arrived in Dustfall as a stranger with a bill of sale and a canvas bag, and something had changed in the past 7 months that she couldn't entirely account for through the logic of transactions and documentation and legal filings. People greeted her by name on the road. Cord had helped her repair a fence section in October without being asked, showing up one morning with a post driver and working for 3 hours and then leaving with a nod. The Carter family had her to dinner twice. Agnes had started saving certain items for her at the store without being asked, because she had learned what Clara needed and when. The woman who had said thank you at the well opening with a child on her hip had brought a jar of preserved fruit to the gate the following week and left it without explanation. None of it was dramatic. All of it was real. This was the thing that Holloway had not been able to buy and could not have taken from her, even if his lawyers had won every argument they had tried to make. The fact of being the person who had been here and who had done what she had done, and who had shown people in this specific community what those things were worth. You can't transfer that through a deed. You can't challenge it in county court. It exists in the ordinary fabric of daily life in a place, and once it's there, it's there. She had not come to Dustfall to become anything in particular. She had come because she had enough money for this land and not enough for better land, and because Mara Voss had told her something underneath the surface was worth finding. She had not planned to open a well to 50 people during a drought. She had not planned to beat Garrett Holloway at a game he'd been playing for 40 years. She had not planned to become the person that Agnes would stand up for in the general store, or that Grant Carter would trust enough to ask for legal advice, or that Cord would help with fencing on a Tuesday morning. She had just done the next necessary thing, over and over, for 7 months. And the accumulation of those necessary things had become, without her entirely designing it, a life in a specific place that was now unmistakably hers. Not the land. She had known from the beginning that owning land is not the same as belonging to it. The belonging had come from the other direction, from the people she had dealt with honestly and the problems she had solved without extracting every possible advantage and the water she had priced at fair rather than maximum. From the way she had talked to Cord when he came to her fence with his hat in his hands, and the way she had dealt with Holloway at the gate, and the way she had said to Eli, "We're getting there," on an afternoon when she wasn't sure they were. These were small decisions. They didn't feel historical when you made them. They felt like the only available option, or the most obvious one, or the one you made because the alternative would have required you to be someone you were not willing to become. But small decisions made consistently over time are not small. They are the thing itself. They are the entire argument. But in the spring, 8 months after she had signed the bill of sale in front of Doyle and his ink-stained cuffs, and the dog had lain down in the shade of the hitching post, and Garrett Holloway had looked at her with the mild irritation of a man whose chess piece had moved unexpectedly, Clara walked the full 62 acres for the first time without stopping. She had done sections of it in the routine of the work, back and forth across the parts being cleared or monitored or managed. But she had never walked the whole perimeter in sequence, which she did on a Sunday morning in late March, when the light was still young and the air had the particular quality that spring mornings in this country have, cool enough to feel like a gift after the long months of drought, warm enough to know it wouldn't last, and so clear that the whole valley was visible from the ridge. 44 acres of the 62 were cleared now. 44 acres where there had been impenetrable thicket, where the grass was coming back in varying degrees of thickness, and the soil was doing what soil does when the thing smothering it is finally removed, recovering its own logic, its own capacity, slowly and without drama, and without requiring much from anyone except the patience to leave it alone and let it work. The remaining 18 acres were still in thicket, still being worked by the goat rotation. She estimated they'd be through it by fall. She had done the math on what the full 62 acres in grass would support in terms of herd size, in terms of milk production, in terms of the second aging barn she still had plans for, and the person she'd need to hire to run it if she was going to continue the Harlan restaurant account and potentially add a second restaurant that Pryor had mentioned knowing. The math was better than it had ever been. Not comfortable. She wasn't sure it would ever feel comfortable, because she had learned that comfort was not her natural relationship to numbers, but real, substantial. The kind of math that describes an operation that exists and will continue to exist. She stood on the ridge next to the well in the spring morning light and looked at all of it. The property. The valley beyond it, beginning to show signs of the moisture returning after the drought, faint green threading up at the edges of the road, the creek on Holloway's Ridge audible from here on quiet mornings, the whole landscape in the slow process of reconstituting itself. She looked at Dustfall in the distance, the buildings of the town just visible, the road running into it from the south. She thought about the morning she had arrived on that road with her canvas bag and her bill of sale, and no one who expected her to succeed at anything. Eli came up the ridge behind her. He had started arriving earlier and earlier in the mornings as spring advanced, which she understood as his own version of investment. The operation had become something he was building toward as much as she was, and she had started paying him properly since October, a wage she was not ashamed of, and the conversation she expected to have with him in the next few months about what his long-term role here looked like was one she was looking forward to in the way you look forward to things that are important and overdue. He stood beside her and looked at the valley. "You ever think about the auction?" he said. "The day you bought it?" "Sometimes." "What do you think about it?" Well, she considered the question seriously. "I think about how everyone standing there knew exactly what that land was worth, and they were right by every measure they were using, and how the measures were wrong." She paused. Not wrong because they were stupid, wrong because they were looking at what was visible and not what was underneath. Eli was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you do? Look underneath?" "I try to," she said. "I don't always manage it, but I try to figure out what a thing actually is before I decide what it's worth." He thought about this. General figured out the well before any of us. He did. Maybe he was looking underneath. She looked at him. He was grinning, that barely contained grin, and she shook her head and turned back toward the barn because it was a Sunday morning and there was still work. She had learned something from this valley, and from these 8 months that she had not known when she arrived, or had known in the abstract the way you know things before they've cost you anything. She had learned that most of what people call impossible is just unproven, that the difference between dead land and living land is usually not the land. It's whether anyone has had the patience and the stubbornness and the specific practical knowledge to clear what's smothering it. She had learned that the way you treat people when you have something they need tells you more about your own character than almost any other situation life arranges, and that the decision you make in that moment has longer consequences than you can calculate at the time. She had learned that belonging to a place is not a condition that exists before you arrive. It is something you build, with the same kind of work and the same kind of patience you bring to anything else you're serious about, and that it cannot be bought or transferred or legally obtained. It can only be made through the small decisions, through the fair price and the honest answer and the open gate and the water that keeps coming up cold and clear from 30 feet below. The goats were moving through the northwest section when she came back down from the ridge, working through the last of the heavy thicket in that corner with their usual aggressive cheerfulness. General was at the front of the group as always, moving into the brush with a particular conviction that Clara had come to understand as the nature of the animal. He did not approach obstacles tentatively. He went directly at them and expected them to give way, and they usually did. She watched him for a moment, Then she went into the barn to check the Thursday batch, which Ruth had left aging on the racks in perfect order, the rounds labeled and dated in Ruth's careful hand. 22 rounds this week, more next week if the herd numbers held. A meeting on Wednesday with the second restaurant contact Pryor had mentioned, the one in the larger town 3 hours north. A fence repair on the east section that Eli had identified yesterday. A letter to Webb about the final documentation for the second water access registry period. A conversation with Grant Carter about whether his family wanted to talk about some kind of formal arrangement with the adjacent land, now that the boundary was clean and the valley had a different future than anyone had imagined a year ago. A life. A specific, grounded, demanding, real life in a place that was now unmistakably home. She pulled the notebook from her apron pocket and opened it to the current page and wrote down what needed doing this week, in the plain, functional way she had written everything for 8 months. No ceremony, no reflection, just the next necessary things in order. At the bottom of the page below the list, she wrote one more line. Not because anyone would read it, not because it was part of any plan or document or communication, just because it was true, and she wanted it written somewhere. The land knew what it was. It just needed someone to stay long enough to find out. She closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket and went out to help Eli with the morning rotation. The well kept its water. The land kept its green. And out on the northwest edge of 62 recovered acres, General moved through the last of the heavy brush without slowing down, without hesitating, pushing into the thorn wall with the cheerful stubbornness of a creature who has never once considered that the thing in front of him might not eventually give way. It always did.